The wind howled across the barren plains, carrying with it the dust of 1,000 forgotten stories. Cowboys were not men easily shaken, not in a land where the sun blistered skin, and the earth demanded resilience for every breath taken. Yet, on that fateful evening, Daniel Harper, the kind of man who could rope a steer blindfolded and ride through a storm without flinching, found himself confronted by a plea that rattled the very marrow of his bones. "Please, don't take the cloth off," the voice quivered. It was a woman's voice, fragile and desperate, cutting through the silence of his dimly lit ranch cabin. She sat in the corner, huddled in the rough wool blanket he had given her after finding her collapsed near the creek bed. Her hands clutched at the fabric as if it were her lifeline. Her face was obscured, wrapped tightly in a faded cloth that covered from her brow to her chin. Only her eyes, two trembling oceans of fear and sorrow, were visible. Daniel had brought home strays before, injured calves, abandoned pups, once even a starving child who had lost her way from a wagon train. But never had he seen anyone so fiercely protective of a piece of fabric, as though its removal would mean the unraveling of her very existence. He crouched by the fire, the orange glow painting the lines of hardship carved into his face. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice carrying the steadiness of a man used to calming skittish horses. "You're safe here. You've got no reason to fear." Her head shook violently. "Safe," she whispered. "There is no safe. Not for me. Not anymore." Something in her tone gnawed at him. He wasn't a man of many words, but he knew the cadence of truth when he heard it, raw and unvarnished. For hours, he left her be, letting the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the night lull the silence. But the words kept circling in his head like vultures. "Please, don't take the cloth off." The story of how she had arrived at his doorstep was simple, and yet not at all. He had been riding back from town, the saddlebags heavy with flour and coffee, when he saw her stumble from the scrub brush and collapse in the dirt. She had no horse, no supplies, nothing but that cloth wrapped around her face and a torn dress that told the tale of hard miles. He had lifted her onto his horse, felt the frailty in her body, and known she hadn't eaten in days. At first, he thought she was running from something ordinary, perhaps an abusive husband, or maybe outlaws. Women often carried their pain quietly in this land, swallowing it down until it ate them alive. But the fear in her eyes was different. It was deeper, older, as though it had been carved into her soul. That night, as the wind outside turned cruel, Daniel poured her a tin cup of broth. She drank in silence, hands trembling, eyes never leaving him. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was softer, almost pleading. "You've been kind. Kinder than I deserve. But promise me, cowboy, promise me you won't look under this cloth. No matter what happens." Daniel frowned, curiosity gnawing at him. "And if I do?" Her gaze flickered to the fire, her breath uneven. "Then you'll see what they saw. And you'll leave me, like everyone else." The words lingered, heavy as lead. Days passed. She refused to tell him her name. He called her Miss, and she called him Cowboy. There was something almost childlike in the simplicity of it, a strange tenderness formed from unspoken boundaries. She helped where she could, mending, sweeping, feeding the chickens, but always with that cloth wrapped tight, as though it were stitched to her skin. The townsfolk grew curious. When Daniel rode in for supplies, they asked questions. "Who's the woman at your place, Harper?" the blacksmith cried. "Heard tell she don't show her face." Daniel shrugged them off. He had never been one for gossip. But the whispers grew, the kind that turned into suspicion. Out here, anything that wasn't they understood was quickly branded as dangerous. One evening, under a sky smeared with lavender and dying light, she stood outside the cabin, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He stepped out beside her, the leather of his boots crunching softly in the dirt. "You've got the look of someone still running," he said. Her hands tightened at the blanket around her shoulders. "Because I am." "From who?" Her silence stretched so long he thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice cracked with pain, she whispered, "From the world." That night, as she slept fitfully near the fire, Daniel sat awake, staring at the shape of her beneath the blanket. His heart wrestled with itself. A man ought to respect another's boundaries, he told himself. But there was a gnawing ache in his chest, the kind that came not from curiosity, but from a deeper place, compassion. He wanted to know, not for himself, but for her. Whatever secret she bore, it had caged her in silence and shame. And he could not stand cages. So, against her plea, he leaned closer. His hand trembled as he reached out. The cloth was old, its fabric frayed. He hesitated, her words echoing in his skull, "Please, don't take the cloth off." But he did. The cloth slipped away like a curtain falling from a window. And Daniel Harper, cowboy, rancher, survivor of dust storms and barroom brawls, was shattered. Her face was a mosaic of scars. Jagged lines twisted across her cheeks, her lips, her chin. The skin looked melted in places, as if fire itself had kissed her and refused to let go. One eye, clouded and pale, spoke of sight forever lost. He had seen cattle burned in prairie fires, men scarred in mining blasts, but nothing compared to this. Not because it was hideous, but because it was human. Because beneath the ruin was still a woman, breathing, trembling, alive. She woke with a gasp, her hands flying to her face. "No!" she cried, clutching for the cloth. "You weren't supposed to see. I told you, you'll turn away, just like the rest. You never look at me the same." Tears blurred his vision. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. Then, in a voice rough with emotion, he said, "Miss, I'm looking right at you." She froze, staring at him through her tears. "You don't understand," she whispered. "The fire, it took everything. My family, my home, my face. Men called me cursed. Women crossed the street when I walked by. Children screamed. I ran, thinking maybe if no one ever saw me again, I could stop hurting. That glass, it's all I had left to hide behind." Daniel reached out, gently covering her scarred hands with his calloused ones. "And all it did was keep you prisoner." Her breath hitched, her tears falling freely. From that moment, something shifted. She resisted at first, still clinging to the cloth, but Daniel would not let her shrink into shadows. He brought her to town with him, ignoring the stares. When whispers rose, he silenced them with a glare sharp enough to cut steel. At the Mercantile, when a child tugged at her sleeve and asked innocently, "Did it hurt?" she trembled, but Daniel knelt beside the boy and said, "She's the bravest woman you'll ever meet. Sis lived through fire itself." And slowly, the woman behind the scars began to breathe again. Weeks turned into months. Her laughter, hesitant at first, grew into something rich and warm. She told Daniel her name at last, Elena. It rolled off his tongue like music. Elena began teaching children at the little church school, her scars uncovered. She spoke of resilience, of how beauty was not in the skin but in the soul. Mothers wept as their daughters listened, wide-eyed, to the woman who refused to be broken. And Daniel, the cowboy who had once lived only for the land and his solitude, found himself transformed too. He realized that the cloth he had removed that night had not only unmasked her face, it had unmasked his own heart. The emotional climax came one summer afternoon, when the town gathered for a festival. Elena stood trembling at the edge, uncertain if she belonged. Daniel took her hand firmly, leading her into the crowd. Murmurs rippled, eyes lingered, but then, slowly, people began to smile. A little girl placed a flower crown on Elena's head. An old woman pressed her hands and said, "God kept you for a reason." Music swelled, and for the first time in years, Elena danced, her scars shining in the sunlight like battle medals. Daniel watched, his chest aching with pride. He knew then that he hadn't saved her. She had saved him. She had taught him that the human spirit, though battered and scarred, could still rise radiant from the ashes. That night, as they sat on the porch, Elena's head resting against his shoulder, she whispered, "I was so afraid you'd look at me and see nothing but ruin." Daniel kissed the crown of her head, his voice steady and sure. "I saw ruin. But I also saw survival. And survival, that's the most beautiful thing eBay ever laid eyes on." The stars stretched infinite above them, a quiet reminder that in a world filled with storms and fire, there was still light, always light. And so, the story ended not with the cloth hiding her scars, but with the cloth folded away, forgotten. For Elena had learned to live unhidden, and Daniel had learned that sometimes the greatest courage is not in facing the wild outside, but in loving what the world calls broken.